Aloha, and welcome to this presentation of the Vegan Society of Hawaii. Today, we're really happy to welcome JoAnn Farb. As a microbiologist with a global pharmaceutical company, JoAnn Farb toured lab animal testing facilities, pharmaceutical manufacturing plants, and factory farms. After coming face to face with the fact that her food choices were the reason that animals were living horrific lives in these places, she became a vegan in 1991, before she had yet met a single other vegan. JoAnn Farb's talk today is entitled Healthy Aging. Aloha, JoAnn.
Aloha. Good afternoon. I want to show you my slides, and I want to talk with you today about healthy aging. And I'll tell you right up front, I think some of the perspective that I'm going to share with you might be a little bit different than anything you've ever heard in this space before. By virtue of the fact that I had a rather unusual position within the pharmaceutical company that I worked for. And it allowed me to connect some dots and has really been influential in the perspective that I have. I've also kind of selected material hoping to not so much duplicate maybe what other people have shared with you about healthy aging, and hopefully to throw out some new little tidbits and ideas that some of you might not have considered before. I've just put some pictures up of some of the people that have been my heroes over the years. All of them are people that have made it to much older ages with a really high level of vitality and functionality on a plant-based diet. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these people after I get farther into my material. You know, the main idea that I want to present here is that we can't change the fact that we're going to die. Everybody's going to die, 100% mortality rate. But what we do have control over is this idea that I call compression of morbidity. The average middle-aged person can expect to live to be about the age of 78 or 80 and to have about 10 to 12 years of increasing sickness and disability preceding that. But with a healthy lifestyle, you can actually compress that morbidity so that you have maybe a year of declining sickness and disability with a death that's more likely, in the range of 90 to 100. And so that's what healthy aging is really about. It's not just living longer, but actually living better with the years that you have. I think of this equation when I think of the factors that go into healthy aging. There's genes, there's nutrition, there's how much movement and rest we get. There's paying attention to the things we can do to minimize our exposure to toxins. There's a factor that I'm going to talk about at length, which is skepticism of scientific reductionism. And I'm going to go into detail about that because I think it's a really critical one. And then there's love, which is the factor that I use to really encompass our connection with others and having meaning in our life and all of those things. And I won't be talking so much about that, but it does need to be in the equation because it really is an important part of living well and living long. So let's start with genes, because that's what most people think of when they think about what is going to determine how long and how well they live. One of the reasons I think that everybody tends to focus on genes is because that really fits well with the biomedical model and with the lens that powerful industries want us to think about, because that's where they have figured out how to maximize profit and sell us things and technologies. I'm going to reframe this discussion of genes because I want to be able to look at it from the perspective of what we can actually shape and influence. And genes are really just one part of the picture, but they're not our destiny. What are genes actually? They are blueprints for assembling proteins. And there's three basic categories of proteins in our body. There's structural proteins, there's enzymes that actually make things happen, and then there's hormones. Those are also proteins. So the genes are the blueprints that determine how to make these molecules that do different things in our body. If there's a variation in the gene, it can affect how well those proteins do those jobs. Genes are sort of predetermined. However, the environment is what can turn genes on and off. And this often doesn't get acknowledged enough, especially by entities that are advising us about health and healthy lifestyle. When I talk about the environment turning genes on and off, I'm talking about food, our chemical exposures, our emotions, thoughts, stresses we're exposed to. So you can think of it as genes loading the gun, but environment actually pulling the trigger. I want to reframe the genetic discussion in a way that empowers individuals to have some control over their destiny. A good place to start with this is to look at twin studies. There's two kinds of twins. There are identical twins that share DNA and share a prenatal environment. And then there's fraternal twins, which are shown by the darker colored bars on the graph. They share the prenatal environment, but their genes are only as similar as you would expect for any two siblings. And so we can look at all of these different characteristics and traits. When you see that the white bar is almost over to the 100%, that tells you that genes are extremely controlling of that characteristic. And when the white is less than 100%, it starts decreasing. That's the degree to which environment can actually shape that trait more and more and more. And by comparing identical twins to fraternal twins, you can see, for example, height is very much controlled by genes. Not entirely. I mean, obviously, environment affects it. But you see the difference between identical twins that get to the same height versus fraternal twins. And that gives you some idea of the interplay between environment and genes. Now, if you go down this chart and you look at things like hypertension and diabetes, and even breast cancer, stroke, rheumatoid arthritis, you can see that genes actually play a very small role for the vast majority of cases where people struggle with these chronic conditions. Genes are not the determinant by any means for the vast majority of people. One gene in particular that a lot of people are familiar with, and I think is a good place to kind of look a little deeper, is the breast cancer genes. And Angelina Jolie is probably one of the best known people who carries a mutation in the breast cancer genes. And the tendency of her and lots of people is to think that carrying a mutation in these genes means you are definitely going to get breast cancer. But if you look in fact, by the time women reach the age of 70, on average, 12% of women will have had a diagnosed breast cancer by the time they reach age 70. All women, just all women together. If you look at women who carry one of the breast cancer mutations in their genes, so there's a range of different mutations that have been found. Some of them are much more dangerous in terms of cancer, and some are less so. But if you group all of those mutations together, and you look at women who have them and reach the age of 70, you will find that about 2/3 of them will have developed a diagnosable cancer by the age of 70. But what gets lost in this is that women with those mutations, even some of the most severe of those mutations, by the age of 70, still 1/3 of them have not actually had a diagnosed breast cancer yet. And so that's a really important factor to keep in mind. There are a number of factors that we know that do contribute to cancer risk. Things like smoking and eating animal protein, consumption of alcohol, even one drink a week has been shown to increase a woman's risk of breast cancer. Not getting enough exercise, eating a lot of saturated fat, trans fats, and exposure to a lot of hormones, animal hormones through animal foods in particular, but also through pharmaceuticals. Those can all increase one's risk of breast cancer and some other cancers as well. There's also factors that we know about that can reduce your risk of cancer, getting a lot of fiber and phytochemicals. And I'm going to use this term phytochemicals a lot. Phyto just means plant chemicals. So these are the naturally occurring compounds found in plants. There's, tens of thousands that have been looked at and described. And so those are all phytochemicals. Regular exercise can be helpful. The right gut microbiome and gut flora. The diet that we eat very much selects the gut microbiome that we have. And very specifically, eating a lot of plants gives you an increase in the kinds of gut bacteria that reduce the risk of all kinds of diseases. And eating a lot of things from animals actually selects for a different, sort of rainforest in your gut of microbes that can increase inflammation and increase your risk of a lot of diseases. Breastfeeding children, the longer, the better, is protective for cancer. consuming small amounts of phytoestrogens, there's that phyto word, it means plant estrogens, things like soy and flaxseed, especially in childhood, can be very beneficial to preventing cancer. And I want to talk a little bit more about soy here, because I can't tell you the number of friends I've had who've had breast cancer and been told by their doctor, avoid soy, it's bad for breast cancer. And so I think it's really important to talk about what the science actually shows here. In order to understand the issue of soy and cancer, you first need to realize that there are three broad categories of estrogens. The moderately strong group of estrogens are the animal estrogens, what our bodies naturally make and what you can find in meat and dairy, because those animals' bodies make it too. It's fairly strong. There are estrogen receptors all over our bodies on lots of different tissue. You think of them as little keyholes, and think of estrogen like a key that's going to fit into that keyhole and then turn something on. That's what estrogen does. When you have a lot of estrogen in your body, it finds its way into keyholes that can, for example, turn on cancer or fan its growth. Women have, a fair amount of estrogen throughout their life. Men have small amounts of estrogen too. This is happening naturally. Now, if you compare that to phytoestrogens, the plant estrogens, they are weakly estrogenic. They can fit in the keyhole, but they can't turn on to the degree that the animal estrogens have. So they are actually protective, because when you consume some phytoestrogens, they get in the mix, they block those holes, and they don't turn things on as strong as animal estrogens do, and they keep the animal estrogen from docking in that hole. So that is how phytoestrogens are actually beneficial and helpful. Xenoestrogens are the third category of estrogens, and these are actually synthetic estrogens. These are things like, you've probably heard of bisphenol A, BPA. It's in the plastic bottles. It's in the receipt paper that you get like from Costco. It's the developer in the paper, and it actually can come off on your hand and get in through your skin, and it gives you a fair exposure to estrogen. And sometimes I shudder when I see the people at the entrance to Costco or the exit that are checking people off and taking receipts all day long and marking through them, and they don't have gloves on. They are getting a really heavy exposure to xenoestrogens by doing that. DDT is an example also of a xenoestrogen. In every cell, you've got chromosomes, and your genes are on the chromosomes. And what I want to talk about now is something on the ends of the chromosomes. They're called telomeres. And if you think of a shoelace, if a shoelace is like a gene, the ends of the shoelaces where you've got to keep them from unraveling, that little cap on them, that is like a telomere. And our genes have telomeres on them too. Now, when I was getting my basic science education, one of the things we were taught a long time ago was that telomeres never got longer. You started out with a certain length of telomere, and every time the cells divided, the telomere shortened a little bit more, and they were the determinant of how long an organism would live. When there was nothing left, the cells couldn't divide anymore. The lifespan was over. And we find that long-lived animals like turtles have long telomeres, and shorter-lived like fruit flies and mice have shorter telomeres. And so for a long time, the belief was that like humans' telomeres, they only got shorter, they never got longer. It turns out that's actually not correct. And I think Dean Ornish was one of the ones to first publish some of the research showing that a plant-based diet could actually increase generation of an enzyme called telomerase, which could lengthen the telomeres too. And so we now know that can happen based on environmental factors. Exercise can be helpful to increasing telomere length. A plant-based diet that is low in fat and processed carbs, stress management, social support, and caloric restriction is really beneficial. Caloric restriction, I think, is a really important one to know about, and it's something where you can really easily incorporate into your life. And so that's what I want to spend a little bit more time on. You can take any species of animal, and if you restrict their calories, that is, feed them a little bit less than they typically would eat, you can actually increase their lifespan pretty dramatically. And they've shown this with lots and lots of different animals. There's one caveat here. You still have to make sure you are getting sufficient amounts of critical nutrients. So if you restrict calories, but you still get all the nutrients you need, you actually increase lifespan. You also make really hungry animals, and people will want to eat more. But if you can restrict that, then you can actually very beneficially increase the length of your telomeres, reduce chronic diseases, reduce your risk of all kinds of things that you don't want to have happen. So there's a number of different ways that you can restrict calories. One is just to consistently undereat. That's like never been a good way for me. It's not worked for me. And I know lots of other people struggle with that, but animals in labs, for example, that's an easy one to do. And that's where they showed the caloric restriction was so beneficial. Now, another thing you can do is periodic water fasting. You can do intermittent fasting, or you can reduce caloric density. And I'll talk a little bit more about each one of these in a moment here. But when I talked about the importance of getting nutrients, what am I referring to? Making sure you get all the nutrients. It's not just vitamins and minerals that people think of mostly. It's also the right kinds of carbohydrates, which includes lots of different kinds of fiber, thousands of different phytochemicals. It does include protein, amino acids, the right amino acids so you can build the proteins you need, and important essential fats. We need all of those things in sufficient quantities, but still with a restriction of calories for this to work. Let's talk about caloric density, because this is actually the easiest way to reduce caloric consumption. If you think about caloric density, if you were going to compare 400 calories of like a pure fat, such as just any oil or butter or lard, to 400 calories of, say, chicken or meat or something like that, think about the space that it takes up. 400 calories of oil isn't much. And in your stomach, that's not going to make you feel very satisfied or full. 400 calories of chicken will make you feel a little bit fuller, but it's really easy to eat a lot more than that because it's not a large quantity of food. But if you go to eating things like vegetables and beans and greens, 400 calories of those things is a pretty good volume. And that can make you feel comfortably filled up so that it's easier to not eat as many calories. So that's how to use caloric density to your advantage. Going on an actual fast periodically is a really good way to reduce caloric consumption. But if you're going to do, anything more than a couple days, it's really important to know what you're doing. And I really recommend people do it under really good supervision. True North Health Clinic in Santa Rosa, California is an amazing place. They do incredible work, and they've really helped a lot of people with chronic conditions, especially autoimmune conditions, cardiovascular disease. And I think they've even published a few papers now looking at some very specific kinds of cancers that have responded to fasting as well. Doing it there under supervision of people who've managed thousands of fasts and know how to take care of you and do take good care of you is really, really nice, so you can rest and make sure you're doing it in a way that really is therapeutic. That's one of the options for reducing calories. But the easiest one of these, I think, to use is what's called intermittent fasting. And there's a lot of different ways this can be done. One of the easiest is just simply to say, hey, 2 days a week, I'm going to eat nothing after breakfast until breakfast the next day. And so just twice a week, just to go from breakfast to breakfast. It's just a short fast. That can be really helpful. Perhaps even an easier way is just to condense your food into a narrow span of time every day, but just say, I'm going to eat all of my calories for today between like 1 and 4 p.m. If that's a little too narrow for you, even, try to put off breakfast till 11 a.m., stop eating at 4 or 5 p.m. That can be really beneficial too, especially for improving blood sugar. It's amazing for that, and even for weight loss. But an even more simplified version, not quite as beneficial as that, but you'll still get benefit, is to simply say, I'm going to stop eating after 4 p.m. every day. Nothing else after that. Especially you want to make it that you're not eating later and eating for many hours before bed. For one thing, you want your stomach empty when you go to bed. And also, calories eaten in the morning have a much less harmful impact on blood sugar than calories eaten as the day goes on. Excess calories are more harmful to your blood sugar control. So that's how to use intermittent fasting. Sometimes we use the term phytochemicals and antioxidants interchangeably, but phytochemicals basically refers to all of these different kinds of chemicals in plants. They can include the chemicals that give them their pigments, the chemicals that give smells, strong tastes. Those are all different kinds of phytochemicals. And many of them are also antioxidants, which means that they help control oxidation reactions in your body, which can age cells and damage DNA. If you're familiar with Dr. Joel Fuhrman, he has an equation that I have really found helpful. I think about it a lot. And his equation is that health is equal to the number of nutrients you get per calorie consumed. And the idea here is that you want to keep your caloric consumption to a minimum, and you want to maximize the nutrients. Again, the vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, phytochemicals, essential fats, fiber, protein. You want to get enough of those while minimizing calories. The phytochemicals, you want to get as many of those as you can. There's no limit on that as long as you're not over-consuming calories. But some things, obviously, like protein, vitamins, minerals, there are upper limits about how much you would want to get of some of those things. But I want to talk a little bit more here, just focus on the protein, because typically protein is what conventional nutritionists, nutritional scientists have always been focused on. A lot of people still to this day have this idea that protein is the most important nutrient. When in fact, if you're eating sufficient calories and you're eating a reasonably varied diet, you don't need to think about protein at all. You are going to get enough protein. So you can just kind of not think about that from that angle. But what people don't realize is that protein, you can actually get too much protein, and it is actually probably causing more death and disability in our country than I can't say I've ever met anybody who really had insufficient protein that wasn't struggling with some other kind of chronic condition, had Crohn's disease or something else. You don't need to worry about getting enough protein if you're eating a reasonably healthy diet and getting enough calories to meet your energy needs. Protein is kind of a double-edged sword. So we need it for bone health and the brain and, maintaining muscle and creating enzymes. But if you're getting too much of it or the wrong types, it can actually increase bone loss and decrease kidney function. It can fan the growth of existing cancers. And according to Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, animal protein actually damages the arteries, resulting in inflammation. And that can be the starting point for why people pack on the plaques that can, later lead to a cardiac arrest. Does it matter what kind of protein we get? It actually does. There are optimal proteins, and these would be the proteins that are low in sulfur-containing amino acids, which are going to be from plants, and are packed with the protective phytochemicals and antioxidants and fiber from plants. Do not come with cholesterol or saturated fat. Those are the proteins that come from animal products. And we also want protein that's not going to increase our body's production of cholesterol. Those would be the ones from animals. So I've got pictures up here of various kinds of plant proteins. And I will say, especially as people get very much older, if they do have trouble, just eating and consuming enough food, and I did this with my parents the last few years of their lives, I actually made them smoothies and put protein powder into the smoothies, because as they got closer to the end of their lives, they just didn't have much of an appetite. And it was really hard for them to eat much food. By putting some protein powder in there, I made it easy for them to just drink it in a smoothie. And it was really helpful to them. But a really good source of protein, if you're following a plant-based diet, is beans. Not only as a source of protein, though, because they come packed with so many important nutrients. And if you're not familiar with Dr. Michael Greger and his nutritionfacts.org website, I'd really encourage you to check it out. He's broken down all these topics. They're searchable with these, really short little videos where he sort of summarizes the scientific literature on a very specific topic. And he has one video in particular that I really like. It's called Increased Lifespan from Beans. I'd encourage you to watch it, because he talks in there about how all the longest lived populations in the world are ones that include legumes or beans of some kind in their diet regularly. And all the shortest lived populations in the world tend to be ones that don't really eat beans on a regular basis. The other thing that was really interesting he talks in there is about something called the second bean effect. if you eat beans for dinner tonight, not only are they helpful to your blood sugar control that meal, but the next day, when you, let's say you get up and you eat some toast for breakfast, if you've eaten beans the night before, that will actually moderate your blood sugar spike to the carbohydrates in the toast, as compared to if you hadn't had the beans the night before. You will hear sometimes elderly people can benefit from getting more protein as they age. I think what it's really referring to is more protein as a percent of calories, because obviously as we get older and older, we are eventually going to be burning less calories. We do less work. So our bodies become more efficient and we just don't burn as many calories. So we don't need as many calories. And so if you're cutting back calories and you're eating less and less, you're going to be eating less protein. When I was in my 30s and I was really, really active, 50 grams of protein was, a good amount of protein for me. But by the time I hit 70, I may be only burning 3/4 of the calories that I once did. But I'm still probably going to need that same amount of protein. So as a percent of the calories I'm consuming, I will need to make sure that I'm still getting enough protein. And again, that's where something like, protein powder in a smoothie can be helpful as people get older. But here's something that's really interesting to look at. The conventional wisdom is that meat from animals is really the best source of protein. So I kind of want to deconstruct that here for a minute. If you're familiar with those big boxes of baby spinach that you can buy at the store, that's about 1 pound of spinach. And that's about 100 calories in that whole box. Now, I know that's a lot of greens for somebody to eat in one sitting, unless you steam it. Because if you steam that whole big box of spinach, it just becomes like a small amount that you can actually eat pretty easily in one sitting. I sure can. And that's about 100 calories of food, and it has about 12 grams of protein in it. Now, to get that much protein from a piece of steak, you would get between 1.5 and 2 ounces of steak. That's like half the size of a 1/4 pounder burger, right? No, we're not talking very much meat. And that would have around 10 grams of protein in it. Which do you think is going to give you more nutrition overall, though? Because we don't want to look at just the protein. We want to look at what else is coming with that. And it's the protein from the spinach that's going to come with thousands of phytochemicals and the fiber, and is not going to come with the things that fan inflammation and increase risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease. You've probably heard lots of people say, well, I couldn't be vegan because I'm an athlete, right? And I just have to have all that animal protein. So I thought it'd be nice to just take a look. These are all examples of elite athletes that are not only plant-based, but for most of them, their very highest achievements came after they had switched to a plant-based diet. I mentioned blood sugars a few slides back a little bit, and we all know it's important to keep our blood sugar in a healthy range. There are some misconceptions out there, though, about what really messes up our blood sugar. And a lot of people think it's eating carbohydrates. And you'll even hear a lot of people with diabetes, and even diabetes educators sometimes will say, you've got to eliminate or just cut way back on carbohydrates to control your diabetes. I think that's kind of misunderstanding what actually is going on. You see, diabetes is a condition characterized by an abnormal response to carbohydrates. But it's not actually the carbohydrates that set in motion the whole problem initially. It's actually fat. When the body has too high of a level of fat, and especially trans fats and saturated fats are worse for this, they can start to muck up the insulin receptors on the cells themselves and make it hard for the insulin to do its job. That's what causes insulin resistance. So the more fat you have either in your diet or even just, fat in your body, visceral fat especially, the more it sort of dumbs down your insulin receptors. And it's been known going back to like the 1920s, I think, that you could just take a healthy person and feed them a really high fat diet for several days and push them into being, borderline diabetic with testing, just by restricting carbs and giving them a ton of fat. And likewise, you could take people who are borderline diabetic and you could cut the fat out of their diet and feed them nothing but carbohydrates. and you could make the insulin resistance go away. We've known that for a long time, but people still sometimes get focused on this idea because if you're testing blood sugar, if you've got diabetes and you're testing blood sugar, you will see if you eat carbs, your blood sugar will increase. But keep in mind that's the blood sugar the increase is like the the warning light on your dashboard in your car. It's overheating. By not eating carbohydrates, it's like you're cutting the wire to that light. But the insulin resistance hasn't gone away. It's still there waiting for the moment that you get carbs. And if you restrict carbs too much, you are restricting your consumption of all those phytochemicals and fibers that are really critical for improving health and longevity. If you want to optimize your blood sugar, what you want to do is begin every meal munching on lettuce. This will moderate your blood sugar spike, or any greens, any kind of leafy greens. If you start your meal with that, it actually will modify how much the blood sugar increases from whatever other carbohydrates you're eating. You want to eat beans and legumes as much as possible. When you're eating fruit, especially if you do have blood sugar issues, you want to move towards eating berries. They tend to be a lot better for your blood sugar. And it's really interesting too. If you eat like tons of strawberries, for example, and I've actually tested this out with people, you eat tons of strawberries, it will spike the blood sugar really quickly, and then it will actually drop down lower than what it was before you even tested. There's polyphenols and other phytochemicals in there that actually lower blood sugar. You want to make sure you get a lot of exercise, walking or running for at least an hour every single day. You want to eliminate processed carbs from the diet. It's really important to distinguish carbohydrates. When I use that term, I'm referring to starchy vegetables, whole grains, beans, legumes. Those are healthy carbohydrates. Those you want to have in your diet. What you don't want to have are the processed carbs like white rice and pasta made from refined grains, bread, even air-popped popcorn without anything on it acts like a processed carb in terms of how it affects your blood sugar. They're broken down very quickly and they make your blood sugar spike very fast. There are supplements that can be helpful to optimizing blood sugar, things like chromium, alpha-lipoic acid, nopal cactus, docosahexaenoic acid, the DHA and the EPA, long-chain fatty acids. I'll show you some of the supplements that I think are really good for that too. And fasting is incredible for optimizing your blood sugar, and it's the fastest way to reverse insulin resistance. One of the things I think is really important for everybody to know about, not just vegans, is that it's really critical as we age to make sure that we have a reliable source of B12 in our diet. Even 25% of meat eaters over the age of 60 have been shown to be deficient in vitamin B12. And if you have suboptimal levels even, you may have no obvious symptoms, but it can silently increase your risk of coronary artery disease and dementia and be contributing to premature aging. So you want to make sure you've got your B12 covered. If it gets more serious, it can actually cause symptoms that mimic multiple sclerosis and other kinds of neurological degeneration. And the Institute of Medicine actually recommends that everybody over the age of 50, not just people following a plant-based diet, supplement in some way, make sure they have a reliable source of B12 in their diet. And now when I talk about reliable source of B12 too, I'm not talking about foods with B12 in them, because as we get older, there's actually a lot of things that can impede our ability to get that B12 out of the food and absorb it. Things like pernicious anemia, Crohn's, colitis, irritable bowel disease, gluten intolerance. If you're just even lacking something called intrinsic factor, you may not be getting enough B12 from the B12 that you swallow. So it's really good to take a sublingual B12. It can be a spray, it can be a liquid, it can be a lozenge that dissolves in your mouth. I think I've even heard of B12 containing toothpaste if you brush a long time and get a good contact time. But the longer it sits in your mouth, it can be directly absorbed through the mucous membranes. It bypasses a lot of potential gut issues. That's a much better way to get it. Keep in mind, all of the ways for testing for B12 deficiency can have false negatives. I'm skeptical about relying on even B12 testing. Blood testing is a very poor indicator. Probably one of the best is looking at the methylmalonic acid in the urine. You can test from your home your levels of methylmalonic acid in the urine. That's a really good proxy for B12 levels, but even it can sometimes say you're okay and you can still have functional issues. So I think the best solution is just to make sure you supplement on a regular basis with B12. Here are examples of some of the supplements that I personally take. I don't necessarily take all of them all the time, but I use them intermittently. I think you want to make sure you have a good source of DHA and EPA from algae. I really like the Ovega brand because it's not from genetically modified organisms, and it has a fairly high amount of both of those in it. It's a really good source of the omega-3 fats. You want to have a sublingual B12 source. I think zinc is a really important supplement to take to boost the immune system. Vitamin D. I live in Kansas. I think vitamin D deficiency is a really significant factor for the general population, and especially people with more pigment in their skin can have an even harder time getting sufficient vitamin D for at least half of the year. So you want to make sure you're getting enough vitamin D. And vitamin K2 goes along with the D, and it helps your body to better use your calcium and put it into the bones rather than into the arteries. I've alluded to inflammation a little bit, but inflammation is basically a result of oxidation and of a lot of things that happen in the body. Inflammation actually can be beneficial for us. When you get a cut or you have an injury, inflammation is the first step that your body uses to marshal help and to get your immune system revved up so that you can address the potential threat. The problem is if it doesn't then calm down relatively quickly, you now have chronic inflammation. And that actually is very problematic in terms of increasing aging and breakdown of tissues and contributing to things like heart disease and cancer and diabetes. We want to make sure we are putting out the fires of chronic inflammation in our body. And the way to do that is to consume more whole plant foods rich in phytochemicals. You want to make sure that your fats are from whole foods, not from oil. You'll hear people say, but olive oil is a healthy fat. I look at oil relative to whole foods like almonds and flax seeds. Almonds and flax seeds are a whole food, but you can extract almond oil and flax oil from those. Now you've got a highly processed food that has concentrated the calories and reduced some of the fiber and phytochemicals. That is analogous to, you can eat whole beets, which we know are healthy for you. You can also take those whole beets and extract the carbs from them and make processed sugar. So I think of oil is to a healthy whole fat what sugar is to beets. And I think that's a good way to think about it and understand that we really don't want to include oil in our diet. That just increases the calories without giving us any more nutrition. But you do need a good source of healthy fats, and you want those from whole plant foods. And I do think supplementing with a specific omega-3 DHA source is very helpful. Arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fat that is found only in animal foods, but our body can make it from the precursor omega-6s, and it revs up inflammation, and we want to minimize that in our body. And if you want to minimize inflammation, you want to avoid animal protein because it does rev up inflammation from a number of different mechanisms, and it also damages the arteries. You also want to avoid PCBs, and fish are the highest source of those. Cutting out aquatic protein is a really great way. In fact, that reduces your exposure to a whole host of environmental toxins that get concentrated up the food chain. Fish actually sit at the top of the food chain, the fish that we eat. And you also want to keep your iron level in the low to normal. We hear people talk all the time about, you want to avoid anemia. That's what everybody seems to be focused on. Because if you do get anemic, the symptoms are quite obvious, can be quite obvious and dramatic. You'll notice it. But if your iron gets a little bit too high, that doesn't have obvious symptoms like that. And yet it can be very, very dangerous, increasing your risk for all kinds of inflammatory conditions and heart attacks. So you want to make sure you have low normal iron and aluminum. A lot of people don't realize aluminum is very, very pro-inflammatory, especially injected aluminum actually gets incorporated into the body much more and can cross the blood-brain barrier. It very much is there to stir up inflammation. Let's talk about the next factor now, which is movement and rest. And I put these together because we need a lot of movement and we also need to balance it with sufficient rest. Now, you probably all already know you need to be fairly active if you want to maximize your lifespan potential. But, most of us, when we think about exercise, what do we think about mostly, right? It's aerobic exercise. And aerobic exercise is certainly important and certainly very helpful, but it's not the only thing I want you to think about when you are thinking about movement as a way to maximize your lifespan potential. There are some other factors, so I want to talk about those a little bit. I'm sure a lot of you know who Howard Lyman is. He was a fourth generation cattle rancher, feedlot operator who in 1996 was on the Oprah Winfrey Show talking about mad cow disease. And that's what got himself and Oprah sued for $20 million. And that's a whole other story. Howard is one of my all-time heroes and a personal friend. I've often thought I should put together a book sometime of like all the different aphorisms I would always hear him say, the different quotes. There's so many that are memorable. But one of the things I've heard him say many times, because he's spoken all over the country for quite a few years, he says 80% of people are following nose to tail. That's one of my favorite Howard quotes. Here's another one that he's well known for saying. He says, it's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you think you know that ain't so. There are lots of things that most of us think are true. And, most of the time, we never have an opportunity to see that they're not. I had an opportunity once to see that something I thought was true was not. And I'm going to share that with you. Howard's also the author of the Mad Cowboy book. Fantastic book and story. If you haven't read it, I'd really encourage you to. We hear a lot about scientific consensus these days, and that's almost a way to get us to sort of shut down our critical thinking, is just to tell us, the scientific consensus on something is X, and then it's like a conversation stopper. One of the things that I grew up with anyway, that there was a lot of scientific consensus around was how many physical senses do humans have, right? And from my youngest days and most children's youngest days, we're all taught how many physical senses do humans have. And I'm leaving out whether you think there's ESP or not. That's not what I'm talking about here. When I'm talking about physical senses, I mean senses that we have, physiological mechanisms that we know, that we understand, how they work, like eyes. We understand a lot about visual processing and how it connects with the brain. That's a real physical sense, and we understand the mechanisms for it. Hearing, right? Is another one. So how many of those kinds of senses do we all agree humans have, right? We've all grown up hearing this number a million times, 5 physical senses. Before I deconstruct this a little bit more, here's just a few other things that, there's been scientific consensus about. Telomeres never increase in length, as I mentioned earlier in my talk. Lead in gasoline is not harming us. DDT is so safe. Children can play in the spray. And some of you may remember this. In fact, I have a friend who told me when he was growing up, he remembers the DDT trucks coming down the road and all the kids running out and getting in the spray of the trucks. They were spraying the grass and the sidewalk on either side of the street with DDT for mosquitoes, I guess. The kids they thought that was fun, and they'd come and they'd run and they'd play in the spray, and their parents didn't stop them and the truck drivers didn't stop. Everybody thought DDT was perfectly safe. That was the consensus. Another one was that coronary bypass surgery is our best initial response to angina. My dad faced that when he was in his 60s. They wanted to do bypass surgery because he had angina. And thankfully, he did his own research and decided not to get the bypass surgery, switched to a plant-based diet. And within 2 weeks, his angina went away, his blood pressure came down, his cholesterol came down. It was pretty incredible. And now I think they're starting to change a little bit about the bypass surgery is the best initial response to angina. But for a long time, that was the consensus. And one that's just now starting to fall away is this idea that fluoride in drinking water is good for health. But that is really starting to hit the mainstream in a big way now. Some interesting things are happening there. So if you haven't heard that yet, I'd encourage you to research that too, because the consensus is starting to shift now that fluoride in drinking water is not such a good idea. I think the way to think of scientific consensus is it's a snapshot in time rather than, it's not some kind of biblical passage. So have a healthy skepticism about whatever the scientific consensus is. always question, always challenge, because that actually is what the scientific method is. So getting back to this idea from, Howard Lyman, where he says, it's not what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you think you know ain't so. Here's what happened to me. One night I went to bed. Everything was normal in my world as it had been. But when I woke up the next morning, I had an epiphany that we have 6 physical senses, not 5. You see, I woke up with a vertigo, which I'd never had before. I didn't really hardly even know anything about it. And I woke up and the room was spinning so severely, I couldn't even get to the bathroom without closing my eyes and crawling on the floor and feeling my way there. That's how bad it was. I felt like I was going to throw up if I had my eyes open. If you didn't realize that a sense of balance is every bit as much an important physical sense as taste, touch, smell, vision, if you didn't realize that, let me assure you, if you ever experience a loss of your sense of balance, it is every bit as disabling as losing any other sense. Because, in the sense of balance, we have those semicircular canals in the ear that we understand is a mechanism to give us balance, right? Many of us grew up thinking 5 physical senses is it. But in fact, we have at least 6 physical senses. That's an easy to demonstrate fact. So I threw that out just to kind of give you an idea here, because we're gonna go somewhere with this. But I want you to just be willing to question ideas that everybody believes are true, everybody knows is true, because I think that can really be significant in terms of protecting your health and longevity. But a little bit more on balance training. After having this experience and learning more about balance, I discovered balance is really critical to things like preventing fractures, maybe even more so than bone mineral density. I would encourage you to think about balance when you're doing any of your activities and your exercise. You want to incorporate balance training. It can be jumping on a trampoline, even standing on a pillow with your eyes closed on one foot, Tai Chi, dancing. There's, this half ball thing you can balance on. You want to challenge yourself, eyes open, eyes closed, whatever your level that you can improve or push it on. You want to do that with balance. That's what trains your entire system to improve your sense of balance. And that is significant for reducing the risk of falls as you age. Balance is really important. There's these devices called vibration plates that can be helpful not only for training balance, but actually for building bone mineral density as well. The one on the bottom here is kind of a gym quality one, really expensive, but you can buy inexpensive ones for just a couple $100s that you can have in your home. And when you stand on them, it's a little bit like the sensation of standing on a motorboat, going over choppy water. But you've learned to balance on that, and it really vibrates your muscles and your bones. So any kind of resistance work you do on a vibration plate, you actually get far more benefit for every minute you're doing it there as compared to just, doing squats, for example, on the plain ground. You get a lot more benefit if you're doing them on a vibration plate. You've probably all heard about strength training, that's really important because it builds lean body mass, improves insulin sensitivity. It also makes your bones stronger. And this is part of what's going to keep you able and independent to do basic tasks all your life. Like you want to get a box off a shelf that's high up in the closet. If you're strong enough, you can still get that off and take it down. So do pay attention to strength. If you've already been exercising, something you might want to add that's really beneficial is called high intensity interval training. It has some benefits beyond regular aerobic exercise. And just if you just look it up, high intensity interval training, HIIT, it's abbreviated. But basically it involves like 20 seconds at maximal intensity. You're riding a bike just as fast as you can, like for 20 seconds. And then you take a 10-second rest and recovery, riding slow. And then you just repeat that 8 times. That's like what a high intensity interval training circuit is. Do that, a couple times a week. That will not only give you more fat burning and improve insulin sensitivity, more so than regular cardio, but it's really beneficial for the brain. The most important part is to give it a 100% effort. The other part of movement is rest. We do have to have sufficient rest. And by rest, what I'm really referring to here is sleep. If you have not figured out how to get adequate sleep most nights, you will be unable to maximize your lifespan potential. The next factor that I'm going to talk about is how important it is to reduce our exposure to toxins. And so this involves, there's a lot of different ways we take toxins in. Water, we want to make sure you're drinking properly filtered water, that you're using safe cleaning products, and I would even say makeup and personal care items. You want to make sure that, you do your research, find out what the chemicals are you don't want to be exposed to, and then get the products that don't have those. You want to be careful around aerosols and smokers. And I threw bone meal in because some of you may garden or you may be around people gardening. It's really common for gardeners to want to put bone meal on their flowers, for example. That bone meal is a slaughterhouse byproduct. It contains often the things in it that are not suitable to put into the food system. It can include parts of diseased animals or parts of animals that may contain prions. These are thought to be the causative agent, like for mad cow disease and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. And if you inhale them, it actually is thought that that is a more effective way of getting them to your brain than even eating them. So you want to be careful that somebody's dusting their flowers. Go far away. Don't be around them while they're doing that. And even, organic. I remember once I went to this class that was being taught by some local market gardeners and learned, I had never known before, that organic farmers in my area, at least, they actually do a foliar feeding of their greens, of their lettuce and their kale and their chard, spraying them with blood and bone meal. They're spraying on the greens that I'm buying and eating. I don't know that the large producers do this. I haven't ever heard that, but I think small niche farmers sometimes do that. You can avoid that if you can find veganic farmers. These are vegan organic farming methods that do not use any animal inputs at all. So look for veganic over organic. Want to reduce and eliminate, a lot of processed food has a lot of toxins, additives that are toxins in them. And of course, you want to eat as low on the food chain as you can. That's plants. Because when you eat an animal or you drink their mammary secretions, you are consuming their lifetime exposure to all the toxins. They concentrate them in their body, and then you're getting those when you eat them. So eating low on the food chain, you're at least not eating the lifetime exposure of some other creature to toxins. A whole set of toxins you want to be careful about are metals. Iron, as I had mentioned before, iron, if you have too much iron in your body, that's actually problematic. You need enough to carry oxygen in your blood, but you don't want more than that because it's an oxidant. It does the opposite of what antioxidants do. That's why we eat the fruits and the vegetables, is to balance out those oxidation reactions. So be careful about not consuming too many metals. Copper and aluminum are implicated in Alzheimer's risk. Mercury is toxic to the brain. We know that lead sometimes has been in people's water, and you can be exposed to it in old paint. Did you know that it's also being found in a lot of cocoa, even organic cocoa? So you're going to have to do your research and try to minimize your exposure to these metals. Another thing I wanted to say about aluminum and why you want to be careful about aluminum, or another thing, a reason why you want to have low protein in your diet, is because a lower protein diet actually protects your kidneys, and your kidneys will help remove some of the aluminum, if you're consuming it. If you eat aluminum, your kidneys can help remove it. If it's injected into you, your kidneys aren't so efficient at doing that. We all have a 60% lifetime risk of experiencing some kind of decrease in kidney function. And often the early decreased kidney function happens without obvious symptoms, and it could make it harder for you to clear aluminum from your body. And finally, the last factor I think that we all need to be aware of, or that we all need to work on, is I put as love, but I use this to embody really, it's our social connections, it's volunteering, it's contributing to others, it's mentoring young people. That's really important to our health and well-being and longevity as well. And I'll just close this out by sharing from another one of my heroes, Donald Watson, who he and his wife are often credited with coining the word vegan in 1944. He basically said, veganism is a way of living which excludes all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to the animal kingdom and includes a reference and compassion for all life. And, he went vegan in 1944. He lived to the age of 95 years on a plant-based diet, even before we understood all of the things that we now know that actually make it easier to be a really healthy vegan. And he was very functional. I know somebody who went for a walk with him like 1 year before his death. They went hiking, and he was vigorous and vibrant. So he had that, compression of morbidity to the last year of his life before he died. That is a great question. And I think I may have even asked that question once at Summerfest a long, long time ago. And so the answer I was given was, we haven't done the kind of research on other beans that we've done on soy. So at least at that time, we didn't have the data, but it was reasonable to think that there's probably some estrogenic effect from all the legumes. That's likely. And it's, flax seeds also have phytoestrogens in them. I mean, clover, there's lots of things that have phytoestrogens in them. So I think they're fairly well distributed in the plant kingdom. Whether they have as high a levels as soy, I don't know. So, I like drying as a food preservation method, and freeze drying, especially if you've got access. I mean, that takes a little more technology to be able to do that. It's a little more expensive than just your average dehydrator, but you can buy freeze dried products. I think it's pretty good in terms of, minimal destruction of a lot of nutrients. Fresh is always the best, but and you live in Hawaii, so it's not quite as important to you there. But for us in Kansas, freeze drying, I think, would be a really good method of food preservation. If you steam it, first of all, it won't be so much. It'll be a much smaller portion. And you could drizzle, a little lemon juice or a little apple cider vinegar on it. And that actually helps in terms of reducing the impact of the oxalates in there. And so some people might not want to do that a whole lot. If you're prone to oxalic acid kidney stones, you might want to limit it. And you certainly don't want to have it just be spinach be your only green. I just gave that as an example just for the comparison. But you want to eat a wide variety, and you want to make sure you're eating a lot of low oxalic acid. I just want to say thank you so much for letting me present to you.
Just want to say thank you very much, JoAnn Farb, for your thought-provoking and informative presentation. Mahalo.